Evolution of the PlayStation consoles from 1994 to 2020. Before Sony releasing the Sony PlayStation, Nintendo announced the Nintendo PlayStation in 1991. The console would have been Sony's first PlayStation console, yeah. Also, it would have been the Super Nintendo Entertainment System's remake for a disc insert colored. If the disc system was the Super Nintendo Entertainment System's disc remake colored, it would receive the longest name, which is the Super Nintendo Entertainment System Compact Disc Read-Only Memory System, known as the SNES CD-ROM System aka Super CD-ROM System. The console was heavily inspired by the prototype. It also was inspired by the SNES prototype, a select button that allows the user to browse the game's menu and a start button that allows the user to start the game. The X, Y, A, and B have direction to the player, its meaning to the top or jump, the Y meaning left direction, while the A means right, and B meaning down. Until 1994, when Sony announced the PlayStation prototype console #1.it was a prototype for the Sony PlayStation until its release in Japan in December 1994 and North or South America in September 1995. Then a weird prototype came with no option to start the game or go to the game's menu. Instead, it has a prototype logo and 6 buttons instead of 4. It came the last model, with only the start option and no option to go through the game's menu, and is inspired by the SNES controller. It had 4 buttons. The first one only is big, while the second, third, and fourth buttons don't. Until December 1994, the official PlayStation controller was released in Japan, and later with a different design in North America. Inspired by the SNES controller, it was the first ever controller to have handles long before Nintendo released the Rumble Pack for the Nintendo 64. In 1996, also the release date of the PS1, the same year, 1996, the square, triangle, circle, and X buttons have a meaning, the square meaning a piece of paper referencing the game's menu, triangle referencing the viewpoint of the player is headed, and circle and X buttons meaning yes and no, like tic-tac-toe. In April 1997, the dual analog was released for the updated version. If the PlayStation, it has a bar in the bottom of the analog button, which the analog button allows the user to turn analog functionality off. It wasn't the first controller that has analog, as the NES was released in 1983. As with analog, it was the first analog controller in the PlayStation 1 controller series. Instead of just doing nothing, still waiting for the character to rotate. Just 4 months after the release of the dual analog and version came the DualShock, which was released in Japan. It has no features or updates to the controller, basically looking like the dual analog, and later in different regions like North America. In 2000, the Sone has been released, but with nothing but just a console. In the PlayStation 1 series in its own, like its view from the dual analog and DualShock. It also came in different colors. Later, the PS2 came out, but there never came a STWO. The original controller had in black. In 2003, there came a PSX, a emulator, and the weird update was it also had a remote. The remote was similar to the first ever LG television, but Sony made it. The remote featured 48 buttons, making it the console with the longest remote buttons. The PSX console was white like its first console. In 2005, the Boomerang was unveiled in E3 on 2005, and it was a prototype of the console like the PS1. It was a Boomerang toy compared to its console form. It was the first console or prototype console to have a PS button instead of a analog button that turns analog off. A weird analog introduced. In 2006, the PlayStation 3 controller known as the 6-axis has been released. It has a new look like its older rivals and didn't have the button to turn analog off. Instead, it had the PS button as a home button. Before releasing the DualShock 3, and someday after the Sixaxis release, Sony was in a copyright lawsuit to remove the vibration of the controller. The vibration first used in the Sixaxis to replace it with the DualShock 3, which didn't have vibration either. No updates. In 2010, Sony announced their first handheld controller for the PS3. In 2010, games, the PlayStation Move. It had the same buttons as the PlayStation consoles but not prototypes. The PS button had the same meaning to the boomerang and a blue circle. In 2013, the DualShock 4 was launched for the PS4. The select was moved to left and start to right. It now has a black bar, and the bar flashes the color used in Grand Theft Auto V. The bar flashes red and black in the back when the player is wanted by a police. The bottom had 12 black buttons. This led the PS button to move down. In 2020, PlayStation released the DualSense with the black and white and blue version. Thanks for watching.